Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a weekly wrap up of the two books I've completed this week. The first is Dictionary of the Khazars, a lexicon novel by Serbian author Milorad. The other is non-fiction. It is Palinarus, The Unquiet Grave. Palinarus here being the pen name that the literary critic Cyril Connolly gave himself. So I'm going to start with Dictionary of the Khazars. What a wonderful book this is. 5 stars. The Kazaars were a tribal people who lived between the 7th and 10th centuries around the Caucasus in southern Russia. But they totally disappeared, and everything about them, their culture, their language, ceased to exist. And so not much is known about them. And what Pavic does here is he weaves a wonderful speculative web, not as sort of history or anthropology, but as sort of playful postmodernism. He posits that the king or the Kagan of the Khazar people had this dream that he was visited by God, who said that while he approved of the Kagan's intentions, he didn't approve of his actual deeds, and the Kagan was perplexed by this dream, and invited a colloquy of the 3 great representatives of the 3 great religions, that's Judaism, Christianity, in this case Greek Orthodox, and Islam, to come and interpret the dream according to their own sort of theological understanding. And the book is structured as 3 different versions of this. One is a Jewish take on it, one is a Muslim take on it, and the third is the Greek Orthodox take on it. And it's arranged like an encyclopedia, so it's not just about the dream interpretation. It's the Kazaars are being disinterred, through the various versions. And of course each of the versions is slightly propagandist in that each of the 3 great religious representatives claim that they won the day, and the Kazaars converted wholly to their religion. So according to the book as a whole, the Kazaars converted to Judaism, Islam and Greek Orthodox, which is why they disappeared, that they were basically totally assimilated. And it's beautifully written. There's so much sort of fable, and I'm not going to call it magical realism because it's not magical realism, but it has a similar effect to magical realism. But it's really the language of fables, where strange and wonderful things happen. And it's just beautifully written. There's, every page has some fantastic imagery. And I think what it is it's a parable, or if that's the right word, of the situation in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. When I visited Yugoslavia just before the Civil War broke out, we went to Bosnia, and you had literally, Russian Orthodox churches next to mosques, next to Jewish synagogues in Sarajevo. It was a real sort of, wonderfully mixed culture. And of course all of that disappeared with the Civil War, where there was sort of ethnic cleansing. And you got a sense of that already, even before the Civil War, because the Jews were no longer in Sarajevo. They'd been cleaned out by the Nazis. And I think the book is pointing at that, even though it was written before Yugoslavia disintegrated and broke up into its several republics. I don't know if Pavic was sort of seeing it coming before it happened, but I think this is almost a plea for that sort of diversity and union despite diversity. It's just a wonderfully entertaining book. Not the normal sort of thing I would have, thought was my taste, but it absolutely won me over. It's not just this playfulness of the writing. There's also some really interesting ideas on things like the soul and the dream world, and how they're linked, that someone's real life, is somebody else's dream, and those 2 people can never interact, because as soon as the dreamer wakes up, he's cut off from the living life of the person he's dreamed about, and that the Kazaars have this sect of what are called dream hunters, who are the people who can link and penetrate the world of between the dream and the living soul. So some very interesting ideas also at play. And on to Palinarus, the Unquiet Grave. This was recommended by David Shields in his book called Reality Hunger, where he listed quite a few sort of epigrammatic style books that he favoured, and this was one of them. Palinarus was the pilot of Aeneas's ship, who ended up overboard, and it's not clear whether that was just an act from the gods, or whether he committed suicide, or whether the crew threw him overboard because they needed a sacrifice to propitiate the gods. But the Unquiet Grave is the ghost of Palinarus, who continued to roam the waves and sort of cause future sailors great sort of apprehension. And this book was written in the early 1940s when the Second World War was raging, and Cyril Connolly, he turned 40, which was a cause of distress for him. Also, he'd lost 4 friends to suicide, and he was cut off from his beloved France, because obviously there was no transport between the UK and France under German occupation. So it is a work of great melancholia, if not actual depression. And it is epigrammatic in style, even though it is written in full paragraphs and sentences. I think the best thing I could do really is read some of the things from here. Before I read, I will say that given that this is a book by a Francophile, it's very aggravating that in this edition none of the French authors quoted are translated. Now, my schoolboy French is good enough to get the gist of a lot of what's quoted here, but when you're talking about sort of philosophers and, what they're saying in French is a bit more subtle than my schoolboy French. So I did find that frustrating, especially when Greek and Latin quotes in here are translated. So that is one criticism I have of the book, but that's not down to the late Cyril Connolly. Okay, so to quote some of his stuff. The 2 errors. We can either have a spiritual or a material view of life. If we believe in the spirit, then we make an assumption which permits a whole chain down to a belief in fairies, witches, astrology, black magic, ghosts, and treasure divining. The point at which we stop believing is dictated by our temperament or by our mood at a given moment. Thus, the early Christians believed in the miracles of false prophets and regarded the pagan gods as devils who had entrenched themselves in secure positions. They were more pagan than I am. On the other hand, a completely materialist view leads to its own excesses, such as a belief in behaviourism, in the economic basis of art, in the social foundation of ethics, and the biological nature of psychology. In fact, to the justification of expediency, and therefore, ultimately, to the ends-means fallacy of which our civilization is perishing. Here he quotes John Donne. We are all conceived in close prison, and then all our life is but a going out to the place of execution, to death. Nor was there any man seen to sleep in the cart between Newgate and Tyburn, between prison and the place of execution. Does any man sleep? But we sleep all the way. From the womb to the grave we are never thoroughly awake. The goal of every culture is to decay through over-civilization. The factors of decadence, luxury, scepticism, weariness and superstition are constant. The civilization of one epoch becomes the manure of the next. So I think you have to be in a certain mood to read this. As I say, it is the musings of a melancholic. Cowardice in living. Without health and courage, we cannot face the present or the germ of the future in the present and take refuge in evasion. Evasion through comfort, society, through acquisitiveness, through the book, bed, bath defence system, above all through the flight to the romantic womb of history, into primitive myth-making. The refusal to include the great mass movements of the 20th century in our art, or our myth, will drive us to take refuge in the past, in surrealism, magic, primitive religion, or 18th century wonderlands. We fly to the Mediterranean womb pockets and dream islands, into dead controversy and ancient hermetic bric-a-brac, like a child who sits hugging his toys and who screams with rage when told to put on his boots. Realities of our time. History constructed out of global blocks. The decline of Europe. Anglo-American rivalry and imperialism. Russian managerial imperialism. Chinese or Japanese imperialism. English national suburbanism. The Great American Vacuum. Massacres and atrocities, poverty, famine. So I think it's a good book. I don't know if it all hangs together, but it is a good book. And it looks at things like first love, whether one wants to live on one's own or live in a relationship, seeking solace in art versus forging ahead to the future and not grounding yourself in sort of dead art, as it were. All these sorts of questions. As I said, there's a lot of love for France. There's a lot of lists of places, obviously very personal to Connolly, as he laments that he's cut off from them, which does drag on a bit because I'm not particularly interested in these places that mean something to him. But it, you know, a worthwhile book. But as I say, I think you have to be in the mood. And that's it. That's my weekly wrap up for the the end of July. So until next time, thanks very much.